It's Friday, it's 12:15, and this is Politics UK. Welcome to your weekly roundup of parliamentary highlights from across the UK. I'll be joined by colleagues in Edinburgh, Cardiff and Belfast, and here in Westminster by our parliamentary correspondent, Susan Hume. This week, the government changes the rules on MP standards.
It's like someone who's been found guilty of a crime, but instead of actually serving a sentence, what happens is that his mates come together and try to change the judicial system. It looks really bad.
Sometimes to do the right thing, one has to accept a degree of opprobrium, but it is more important to do the right thing.
But then, a U-turn.
I and others will be looking to work on a cross-party basis to achieve improvements in our system for future cases.
World leaders have been meeting in Glasgow, but have they done enough?
Far more needs to be done to spare humanity from catastrophic climate change.
The Prime Minister is failing in his efforts to convince the world leaders that more must be done.
And pressure is mounting on the NHS in Northern Ireland.
Our emergency departments are currently operating significantly above capacity. We must realise that we are facing levels of pressure as never before.
Welcome. Well, Susan, as we saw in the headlines, an extraordinary story in Parliament this week over whether one MP broke the rules on lobbying and whether those rules are fit for purpose. What's been going on?
As you say, they were quite remarkable scenes, as we heard just then, shouts of shame. Just to track back, this is all about the Conservative former Cabinet Minister Owen Paterson, who was found guilty by the Standards Watchdog of lobbying on behalf of two firms, paid lobbying to about £100,000 a year. That's over and above his MP salary. The Standards Committee, which polices these things, said that as a result, he should be suspended for quite a long time, for 30 days, and that's something that could lead to a by-election. However, he said that it wasn't fair, the process wasn't fair, he wasn't allowed to appeal, and the government said it rather agreed. So when it came to a vote in the Commons, the government signalled that it wanted to throw the current system rather overboard and re-examine how these things are done in every case, and in this case of Owen Paterson in particular, to put it to one side as all that was re-examined. Well, there was uproar about that, first at Prime Minister's Questions, where Angela Rayner was standing in for Keir Starmer, who missed all the drama because he's still self-isolating with COVID.
The independent standards process found that a member broke the rules on paid lobbying. Surely the Prime Minister accepts that this is and should be a serious offence. Yet we have seen reports that he will respond by scrapping the independent process and overturning its verdict. In no other profession in our country could someone be found guilty by an independent process and just have their mates vote them back into the job.
The issue in this case, which involved a serious family tragedy, Mr. Speaker, is whether a member of this House had a fair opportunity to make representations in this case, or whether as a matter of natural justice, our procedures in this House allow for proper appeal, Mr. Speaker. And that I think is something that should be of interest to members across this House, Mr. Speaker, and should be approached properly in a spirit of moderation and compassion, Mr. Speaker.
If it was a police officer, a teacher, a doctor, we would expect the independent process to be followed and not changed after the verdict. It's one rule for them and one rule for the rest of us.
Mr. Speaker, all the professions that she mentions have a right of appeal, Mr. Speaker, that is what the House needs to consider. And may I respectfully say to her that I believe that she needs to focus, instead of playing politics on this issue, which is what they are doing. I think that she needs to consider the procedures of this House in a spirit of fairness, Mr. Speaker.
He should learn the lessons that if you keep cheating the public, it catches up with you in the end. Yeah. Because while they're wallowing in sleaze, the rest of the country faces higher bills, rising costs and damaging tax rises. Yep. So I ask the Prime Minister, can he tell us what is the projected tax increase per household over the next 5 years?
Yeah. Mr. Speaker, what I can tell her is that what the recent budget did was take cash from those who can afford to pay the most, and it had very substantial tax cuts for the hardest working and poorest families in this country. We cut £1,000, Mr. Speaker, with the universal credit taper relief cut for hard-working families in this country. 2 million families had a £1,000 tax cut, and we're lifting the living wage across the whole country, Mr. Speaker. And what we are also doing, Mr. Speaker, is ensuring that this country gets on with a high-wage, high-skill, jobs-led recovery.
So Boris Johnson there very much defending the recent budget from his Chancellor Rishi Sunak. That was in terms, Susan, of a response to Angela Rayner making a link between sleaze allegations that she was levelling at the government and the cost of living crisis for millions of voters. If we go back, though, to the issues around how MPs are policed and what the government was initially trying to achieve.
That's right. Prime Minister's questions there was followed later in the afternoon by a debate and vote on whether Owen Paterson should be suspended for this 30 days. There was quite a lot of sympathy for Owen Paterson among Conservatives, across the House actually, because his wife took her own life during the investigation process. Andrea Leadsom, a fellow Conservative, had put forward a change which would have had the effect of bypassing the normal system, which is very, very unusual. These things are normally a quick chat, a vote, and it's over. Very unusual to have this debate, very unusual for her to put forward this amendment suggesting a new committee to look at the whole system and put his suspension, his punishment on hold. But the government backed it, and Owen Paterson was in fact, again quite unusually, in the chamber to listen to the debate, though he didn't speak.
Today I come not to defend my right honourable friend, the member for North Shropshire, but to consider the process by which he has been tried. It is not for me to judge him, others have done that. But was the process a fair one?
Some 17 individuals have come forward saying that they wish to give oral evidence, and it was refused that they could do so. And is not the point, whether or not someone is guilty or not of paid advocacy, that there must be justice and that justice must be seen to be done? And in this case, many right-minded people will say justice has not been seen to be done.
We reviewed and read all the witness statements. Nobody asked to make an oral witness statement to us. It is perfectly normal in most workplaces in this country. As a senior retired High Court judge confirmed to me yesterday, for witness statements to be read and considered and not necessarily questioned or cross-examined. We did a perfectly normal, fair hearing for the honourable member.
I just wonder if you could explain why it's appropriate that this new select committee should have an inbuilt government majority, where the Standards Committee doesn't with its lay members. And if this is about trying to improve our processes, why is he running the risk of making it look to anybody looking in from the outside that essentially it's like someone who's been found guilty of a crime, but instead of actually serving a sentence, what happens is that his mates come together and try to change the judicial system. It looks really bad. It does.
Sometimes to do the right thing, one has to accept a degree of opprobrium, but it is more important to do the right thing to ensure that there is fairness.
If today the amendment passes, or if the motion falls entirely, it sends the message that when we don't like the rules, we just break the rules. When someone breaks the rules, we just change the rules.
What the public is observing is a shoddy attempt to turn back the clock to the worst excesses of 1990s Tory sleaze. What they see is the return of the days of brown envelopes and cash for questions, the absolute worst of sleaze and cronyism. What they see is them trying to get one of their mates off the hook by ignoring independent due process and rewriting the rules because it doesn't suit them.
A colleague texted me today to say, and I quote, "Achieving change in this place is tough, but today's amendment could lead to a standard system that is fairer for all. It is so sad that it takes a tragedy for the House to act." There is never a right time to act, Mr. Speaker, but let's please do our best for fairness and please support the amendment today.
Nobody can be above the rules. It is the public who should judge this, and I fear they will find us all wanting if the amendment is carried today. Order!
Order.
The ayes to the right, 250. The noes to the left, 232.
Well, there was a furious backlash, of course, Susan, and then a different plan from the government later in the week.
There was. If some Conservatives didn't back that, they, I think, had their doubts about whether this really was a good look. And if they were in any doubt about whether it was, I think the following morning's headlines, even from some supportive papers, talking about shameless MPs sinking back into sleaze, not what the government would want to see. So, first thing, the following morning, Jacob Rees-Mogg was back in his place with a bit of a U-turn, although in quite guarded language, so a few MPs were confused about what he was saying.
The House voted very clearly yesterday to show that it is worried about the process of handling these complaints and that we would like an appeal system, but that change would need to be on a cross-party basis, and that is clearly not the case. While there is a very strong feeling on both sides of the House that there is a need for an appeals process, there is equally a strong feeling that this should not be based on a single case or applied retrospectively. I fear last night's debate conflated the individual case with the general concern. This link needs to be broken. Therefore, I and others will be looking to work on a cross-party basis to achieve improvements in our system for future cases. We will bring forward more detailed proposals once there have been cross-party discussions.
I think one of the problems with yesterday was the fact that two issues were being put together. One was the case of Mr Owen Paterson, and the other was the reform of the system. And what the leader has said now, I'm not entirely clear whether... I understand the process of going forward on a cross-party basis, but I'm not sure how that leaves the case with Mr Paterson. And perhaps we could have a statement next week clarifying the government's position.
The Leader of the House is quite right. We should never be changing the rules at the last minute for a named individual. There is a potential solution to that, which is that the Standards Committee, on a cross-party basis, could produce another report next Tuesday, which the government could then put to the House next week to deal with the case of Mr Owen Paterson. I think we would be saying exactly the same thing, but it would be a means for separating that out from the issue of whether we should change the system. Changing the system, as he knows, because he's given evidence to our committee, we are already reviewing that. Yes. And there are decent points to be made about things that could be improved in the system. They're not easy things to resolve, but my committee will do its best on a cross-party basis and with independent members, which I think is a valuable addition to the process and is an important part of establishing the trust of the public to take that forward.
Labour MP Chris Bryant. Susan, what will happen now? You heard Peter Bone, the Conservative MP, asking the question about whether a vote will go ahead on Owen Paterson's future. What is going to happen?
Well, Jacob Rees-Mogg wasn't very forthcoming on that, but in fact, Owen Paterson seems to have taken matters into his own hand and has decided to step down as an MP in the future. There's also going to be a debate on Monday. The Lib Dems had pressed for that on the general issue of standards and what the process should be.
Thank you very much for the moment, Susan. Let's go to Scotland now and talk to our reporter at Holyrood, Jenny Davidson. Jenny, there the Scottish Conservatives have raised concerns about drugs in prisons.
That's right, yes. Now, drugs is an area that the Scottish Government is challenged on repeatedly due to Scotland's very high numbers of drug-related deaths. Now, last year there were 1,300 drug-related deaths, and that was the highest number recorded in Scotland, and it's also the highest level in Europe. And earlier this week, the focus did turn to drugs in prisons after 6 prisoners were thought to have overdosed within a couple of days in just one prison in Scotland. Now, one of the ways that drugs are known to be smuggled into prisons is by soaking them into the paper of letters to prisoners. The Scottish Prison Service is dealing with that now by changing its policy and giving prisoners photocopies of letters rather than the originals. But the Scottish Conservatives Justice spokesperson, Russell Finlay, raised questions about what happens to those original letters when prisoners leave prison.
When detector machines return a positive result for drugs contamination, Police Scotland are informed. However, prison staff say that police rarely collect these items. I have a letter here from the Scottish Prison Service explaining their policy. The drug-soaked items are stored, then handed to prisoners upon their release from custody. Officers are angry and worried. They feel complicit in what they describe as state-sponsored drug dealing. Can the Cabinet Secretary explain this extraordinary policy and move to bring that also to an immediate end?
Cabinet Secretary.
Can I say that just as with the photocopying of prisoners' mail, there are legal and other factors which have to be taken into account before measures are taken. There are, whether Mr Finlay likes it or not, prisoners have rights and there are processes which have to be gone through in relation to prisoners' mail. Similarly, in relation to the point that he raises, I don't think it's right to call prison officers drug dealers, even to try and make a political point, in my view. However, it is a serious issue. It's one that he knows, I'm sure, if he's had correspondence from the Interim Chief Executive, that's been taken very seriously and has been discussed with the police as well. And I think I'm also right in saying that the Interim Chief Executive has offered to meet Mr Finlay to discuss these matters and so he can get a better understanding. And I would encourage Mr Finlay to do that. And I'm, of course, as always, happy to meet with him to further discuss the issue.
This is just part of a wider conversation about how to tackle drug-related deaths and drug overdoses. And there are differing views on what the best way forward is and what the best way is to support those with drug addictions in Scotland.
Right, Jenny, tell us about the idea for drug consumption rooms, because there have been calls for those to be established. What is the idea behind that?
Yeah, so the idea behind drug consumption rooms is they're kind of a safe space for people who are addicted to drugs, illegal drugs, are able to take them where there will be support available in the event of them taking an overdose, and it's thought it could prevent some deaths. Now, there's mixed views on this. Some people are calling for them to be set up in Scotland. Others feel that it promotes drug taking. They are in use in a number of other countries already, but the issue in Scotland would be that anyone setting one up, running one or using one might be liable for prosecution, because that would obviously be illegal. Now, the question has been whether the Lord Advocate, who's the head of the prosecution service, could provide some sort of exemption for those running drug consumption rooms in Scotland. Now, the previous Lord Advocate, James Wolfe, was asked about this in 2017 about some kind of blanket exemption scheme, and he said that wouldn't be possible. But this week, speaking to the Parliament's Criminal Justice Committee, the new Lord Advocate, Dorothy Bain, who took up post in June this year, she suggested that she might be able to look at this issue again if some more specific proposals were given for a particular drug consumption room and the details of how that would be.
Potential offences which may be committed in any particular consumption facility will depend on the individual scheme envisaged, the policies and processes within the individual scheme, and the actual behaviours of both the operators and the users. And so the Lord Advocate couldn't actually, as a matter of law, whether through policy or otherwise, decriminalise conduct which was by law criminal, nor could immunity from prosecution be granted in advance. Now, the question of prosecution of in the public interest is something different. And if indeed there is a proposal that's made for a drug consumption facility that is precise, detailed, specific and underpinned by evidence and supported by those that would be responsible for policing such a facility and Police Scotland. And there's careful consideration in and around how these consumption rooms would impact on communities. Then, if that sort of planned use of drug consumption rooms is brought to the Lord Advocate as a very well set out proposal, then in terms of the undoubted crisis that we faced in relation to the number of drugs deaths in Scotland, if it is in the public interest that there should be no prosecutions for those using drug consumption facilities with all the safeguards that are required to be in place, then that would require a fresh consideration.
Now, obviously, this new development from the Lord Advocate doesn't mean that drug consumption rooms will necessarily go ahead in Scotland. There's still going to be a lot of legal questions to be asked. But it's likely that some people will now perhaps come forward with proposals. And it's also a suggestion that the current Lord Advocate may be willing to look at some of these things a little bit different from her predecessor. But this isn't going to stop the Scottish Government and the First Minister in particular being tackled on the question of what the government is doing to prevent drugs-related deaths.
Well, as you say, Nicola Sturgeon will be tackled on it, and in fact has been. The crucial issue of drugs policy and drugs deaths came up at First Minister's questions.
That's right. The Scottish Conservative leader Douglas Ross brought this up again today at First Minister's questions, and he was talking in general about the number of drugs-related deaths in Scotland, but he also went back to that conversation earlier this week with his colleague Russell Finlay about the prison overdoses, and he mentioned actually an even higher number. He was talking about there being a suspected 10 overdoses. Now, he was talking about Russell Finlay having raised this issue 5 times in 2 months about the drug-soaked letters getting into prisons before action was taken, and referring back to Nicola Sturgeon's admission earlier this year that she'd taken her eye off the ball in relation to drugs deaths, he accused her of still having her eye off the ball.
Scotland has the highest drug death rate in Europe. Every solution should be considered to tackle this crisis, and they should be considered urgently. Why did it take 10 overdoses this weekend in a single prison for the government to accept Scottish Conservative proposals to cut down on the supply of drugs in our prisons?
And I've been very open about this, we have a significant challenge when it comes to drugs deaths, and we are determined to make sure that we are open to ideas, to suggestions, and that we are genuinely doing everything reasonable we can to turn that around. Within that overall challenge, there is a particular challenge in our prisons, and I think all of us understand the different factors that are at play there. So I would hope that across this chamber we could come together to welcome the ways in which we are seeking to change past practice, to recognise where perhaps we should have done things differently in the past and do them differently in the future. I hope that there is an appetite to build consensus on this, and to that end, as I've said to the leader of the Conservative Party before, I am open to suggestions, including, of course, as I've said many times in the chamber before, considering the wider proposals that have been put forward in the proposal for draft legislation that the Conservatives have brought. So I continue to be open-minded, and we will continue to seek to do the right things, backed by investment, to turn this situation around.
Now, on this specific issue of prisoner mail, the First Minister said that it was right that they took time to consider the implications of any change, but the Scottish Prison Service was now making this change to photocopying the mail, and she said that she hoped that all the people who'd been calling for this over a long time would now welcome that development. But obviously that's one very specific aspect of the drugs challenge in Scotland, and the Scottish Government is going to continue to be challenged on this again and again, because it's such a complex issue, and there are many aspects for it that it's not easy for them to tackle. So we're going to be hearing about this again.
I'm sure. Jenny Davidson at Holyrood, thank you very much. Let's return to Westminster now, and our correspondent Susan Hume. As you'd expect, one of the big stories has been the climate summit in Glasgow, COP26. What have MPs been saying?
Yes, you would have thought that this big international conference would be what we were all talking about. That's what the government had expected, before it rather derailed its own agenda with that row about policing MPs' behaviour. However, there were some early wins, despite the expectation management I think we saw before the conference that maybe it wouldn't deliver very much. So that there was some success on things like cutting one greenhouse gas, methane, on deforestation. The government will be very pleased with those, and certainly Boris Johnson was sounding pretty upbeat when he reported back to MPs.
Far more needs to be done to spare humanity from catastrophic climate change. And in the meantime, global warming is already contributing to droughts and brush fires and hurricanes, summoning an awful vision of what lies ahead if we fail to act in the time that remains.
The Prime Minister is failing in his efforts to convince the world leaders that more must be done. He has welcomed the commitments in the distant future, and I accept that, when he knows all too well that we need to halve the carbon emissions now, at least by the end of this decade, if we are to keep global temperatures down. It is a time for urgent climate action now, not more climate delay.
I agree with him that the clock is indeed at 1 minute to midnight, which begs the question as why his snooze button was on for so long. But he'll know that the first rule of diplomacy is to walk the talk. So will he now take this opportunity to put real credibility behind his stirring words?
Prime Minister, in pursuit of the dramatic reductions in the minuscule CO2 emissions produced by this country, ordinary people are facing higher petrol prices, higher energy prices, restrictions on what they can drive, replacement of gas boilers, higher green taxes on their declining incomes. Can the Prime Minister understand their frustration and disdain that those who tell them they must bear these burdens fly into Glasgow in their private jets, ferry around the town in their gas-guzzling cavalcades?
So heated discussions about climate change in the House of Commons. Thank you for the moment, Susan. It's also been a big issue, climate change, in Wales this week. Let's talk to our reporter at the Welsh Parliament, Cemlyn Davies. Hello to you. Members there have been keen to look at the Welsh Government's record on climate change, haven't they?
Yes, that's right. That was during First Minister's questions. And in fact, the First Minister, Labour's Mark Drakeford, took part in that session remotely from the COP26 summit in Glasgow, with a couple of technical difficulties, it should be said. But with climate change at the top of the agenda this week, well, opposition parties here saw an opportunity to challenge the Welsh Government on its climate change record and on its targets for cutting emissions. Now, the Welsh Government's target had been to reduce emissions by 80% compared to 1990 levels by 2050. More recently, it has set itself a more ambitious target of reaching net zero by the middle of the century. So that's the background, and let's hear a bit now of the debate during FMQs.
Earlier this year, the Climate Change Committee said that current plans in Wales were simply not sufficient. Indeed, of the 61 risks identified by the committee in its risk assessment of the impact of climate change in the UK, it was worrying to see that 26 of the risks have increased in urgency since the last report back in 2016.
The Committee on Climate Change, in its latest assessment on progress in Wales, gave the stark assessment that the lack of a cohesive economy-wide strategy for 2050 at both UK and Welsh Government levels mean that Wales is not currently on track for the 80% target, let alone net zero.
We're all of us going to have to be prepared to grapple with those challenging decisions in every aspect of our lives, and together to do the things that will make that difference. Our plan, we believe, sets us on that track, but without that determination, not just in government, but across the political spectrum and beyond that as well, then that journey will be very difficult indeed to accomplish.
Mark Drakeford there, insisting that the Welsh Government is on track to reach its targets, including the target of cutting emissions by 37% compared to 1990 levels by the end of this Senedd term in 2025.
Cemlyn, we've talked a lot on this programme about COVID passes in Wales, and now the government wants to expand them further.
Yes, that's right. We found out last Friday, following the government's most recent review of the COVID restrictions and regulations in Wales, that it wants to extend the use of COVID passes. So currently, somebody has to show a COVID pass in order to go into a nightclub or to attend certain large-scale events. Well, under the government's latest plans, there'll be a requirement to show a COVID pass to go to the cinema, the theatre or a concert hall as well. Now, interestingly, this will be subject to a vote here in the Senedd next Tuesday. And if you remember, COVID passes only came into force in Wales because a Conservative MS failed to take part in the last vote on this issue. Now, Labour don't have a majority here, of course, and the Conservatives and the only Liberal Democrat MS here have already said that they will oppose this once again, and so it'll come down to how Plaid Cymru vote. They've suggested that they will back this on this occasion, having opposed it last time. They said a few weeks ago that they hadn't had the assurances that they wanted. But this week, their health spokesperson has suggested that the Welsh Government should actually go even further.
In considering where we can extend those COVID passes further, it's worth pausing for thought and considering the fact that passes had been in place in the stadium on Saturday, but not in pubs around the stadium, which were full of people not wearing masks and not having to show any proof of their safety in being there.
What we've said is, if the situation doesn't improve, then we will have to consider passes in pubs and so forth, but we have to ensure that we work with the sector to ensure that whatever we do introduce is practical.
The Health Minister, Eluned Morgan there. And on this issue of COVID regulations, well, last Friday, following that review, there was a stark warning from the First Minister. He said that unless the situation improves here with regards to COVID rates in Wales, then the Welsh Government will have no choice but to consider reintroducing restrictions when the next review takes place in a couple of weeks.
This emotional debate that took place in the Parliament this week, Cemlyn, looking at the support that's provided for bereaved families. Tell us about it.
Yes, that's right. This a petition that was started by a lady called Rhian Mannings, and she lost her baby son George in hospital in 2012, and she says the family was offered no support in the immediate aftermath, and days later Rhian's husband Paul took his own life. So this petition is calling on the Welsh Government to take steps to ensure that bereaved families who lose a child or a young person under 25 are always offered support or signposted towards support services. And as you say, this led to a moving and emotional debate here on Wednesday.
Providing support to people dealing with sudden bereavement is something we should all aspire to. Acting Presiding Officer, this is an area where Wales can set an example to other nations. And I want us all today, as members of the Senedd, to light a candle that will give people heat and light in the darkest and coldest of circumstances.
We desperately need to ensure that those families, perhaps from our own families here, who unexpectedly lose their child, receive that support that they need to get them through. It is a travesty that some families are left to their own devices and don't receive any support or contact from professionals.
It is about just ensuring that simple request of the immediate support being mandatory. And if we can achieve that, I think that we would be in a better place to support people at the worst of times.
I fully recognise the need for a consistent, clear, immediate referral pathway to be available for families who lose a child or young person wherever they are in Wales. I am committed as Deputy Minister to ensuring that we in Wales deliver just that.
Well, Lynn Eagle also told the Senedd that the Welsh Government had launched a new bereavement framework last week and made money available for support services. Campaigners who had gathered here on Wednesday for the debate said that they welcomed those steps, but said it's important now that things continue in the right direction.
Thank you, Cemlyn Davis there in Cardiff. Let's go over to Stormont now, find out what's been happening with our reporter there, Jim Fitzpatrick. Jim, we heard in the headlines that there's an awful lot of concern about the pressures on the health service in Northern Ireland. What's the latest?
Yeah, the health service here, Joe, well, essentially it's in crisis. Take waiting lists as an example. We've talked about this before. But for instance, in Northern Ireland, hospital waiting lists to get the first appointment, there are about 460,000 people here waiting for that appointment. More than half of them have been waiting for more than a year. And that means that about 1 in 10 of the population here is on a waiting list for more than a year. Now it seems even our emergency care system is under severe strain and at risk of falling over, with the chief executive of one of the health trusts saying this week that it was potential and it was possible that one of the emergency departments, the EDs to use the jargon, could have to close its doors to new admissions if the number of people arriving was similar to what we saw last weekend, where at one hospital a patient had to wait 44 hours for that emergency care. So there was an urgent question put down here in the chamber to call the health minister in to answer and say what he was going to do about it. It was from the DUP MLA, Pam Cameron, and this is what the minister had to say.
Our emergency departments are currently operating significantly above capacity. The pressures on our trust experienced during this summer and into the autumn have been unprecedented, actually often akin to the most difficult winter pressures witnessed previously, but that's what makes the situation actually so serious. As members will recall, I made a statement on the 22nd of September that a hospital emergency department could be forced to close as a result of the pressures. Obviously, I don't want that to happen, nor does anyone working in the trusts, but we must realise that we are facing levels of pressure as never before.
This is not about party politics, this is about people. On all sides of this House, we need to be in this together, and we need to work together to fix this. We have heard through the media an ED consultant from Alton Galvin Hospital apologising for the appalling service over the Halloween weekend due to the huge pressure and lack of capacity. Yesterday, the Northern Trust said we are on the cusp of an emergency department in Northern Ireland having to close its doors. I asked the Minister what action is he taking to ensure that EDs do remain open for life-saving emergency services.
Has the time not now arrived to convene a health summit as requested by the Royal Colleges and unions to get everyone into the room who have an awareness of the problems here and the part of the solution?
I thank the member. In regards to the agency and the different Royal Colleges and trade unions who have indicated the request for a summit, between that request being made, I've made most of them, either individually as Royal Colleges or through the trade union workforce structure that I currently have. What I have indicated to them, and I've indicated to some executive colleagues as well, I'd be minded to do that once I see what the budget settlement will be for health.
So the Health Minister there pinning his hopes on a generous budget settlement from the Executive, which should be settled within the next couple of weeks. The other big thing they've got to do, though, is reform the system. They have a plan, they have a strategy, they haven't implemented it yet because there are tough decisions involved within that.
Obviously a very serious situation. Let's talk about something, though, quite different, which is the change to the High Street voucher card. What's been happening?
OK, so this is free money, essentially, from Stormont, £100 for every adult across Northern Ireland, and it's turning into quite the Christmas present. I've got mine here, for instance. It's a little card you apply for, and they load it up with £100 and send it out to you. You can spend it in shops and restaurants, wherever you like, really. And the idea, I suppose, was conceived at a time when we were in the depths of the pandemic, in lockdown, and sectors such as retail and hospitality were suffering badly. And the idea was to get money into the economy locally at a time when things were tight. The problem now is, because of delays in getting the scheme up and running, because of delays in getting all those cards out to the many people who have applied for it, it means the Minister has had to extend the scheme, and so now you can spend that money up until the middle of December, which of course is the busiest time of the year for shops, restaurants and pubs. So that's why the Minister himself was perhaps a little bit sheepish when he came to announce that extension.
I can today announce that I am extending the deadline
to use the Spend Local cards by 2 weeks, from the 30th of November to the 14th of December. I know this is something that members on the Economy Committee had requested, and I am happy to agree. This will mean that the vast majority of people will have at least 4 weeks to use their card. This means spending their card in local shops, from Belfast to Enniskillen, Cookstown, Newtonards, Portadown, Bangor and everywhere in between.
I certainly support very much the Spend Local message, and I welcome the fact that absolutely everybody who's eligible for this card will have the opportunity to receive it. But will you at least acknowledge, in terms of the initial purpose of this scheme, which was economic additionality, a multiplier effect, and creating economic stimulus where none would exist before, that very few economists anywhere would suggest that the best time to create economic additionality in retail is in the month of December?
I do thank the Minister for coming to the Chamber with a statement, but it does remind me of the famous quote from Shakespeare's Hamlet, that the man perhaps doth protest too much.
So the big question is, will that money be extra in the economy or just substitute spending that would otherwise have happened? We won't know for a while yet, but I'll do my bit to help out.
Yes, happy shopping, Jim. Looks like it might be a good Christmas for you. Thank you there in Stormont. Before we finish the programme, Susan, we've got time to catch up again with what's been going on in the House of Lords. Or not again, but what's been going on in the House of Lords, where peers have been concerned about the recent change to the so-called triple lock on pensions. What's happened?
This is one of the Lords' regular bazookas that they like to fire at government policy. Now, you'll remember that at the last election, the Conservatives wanted to keep, or promised to keep, the triple lock on pensions. So that meant that pensions, the state pension, would rise by either 2.5%, earnings, or inflation, whichever was the highest. Now, at the moment, it really is earnings that are the highest. However, that is a rather freak and artificial result. It's because of the pandemic. A lot of people were furloughed during the pandemic, and that suppressed their wages. Once they were back on their full money, that looked like a massive wage increase, although it isn't really. But that's how it shows up in the statistics. And the government is very keen for that not to track across to the state pension, because they say it would be far too expensive. So they want a 1-year pause in it. They say it'll only be temporary. However, peers say that's not good enough, and it was spearheaded, in fact, by a Conservative former pensions minister who said you must be able to come back with a better system that tracks real wage increases so that the poorest pensioners don't lose out.
Too often, Chancellors have eyed state pensions or pensioners as a tempting target to raid when they need to find large sums of money. Because this is about large numbers of people, but for each person, we are not talking about large sums. But, my lords, this should not be about money. It is about people and the social welfare system. It is about trust in politicians.
But we've got one of the poorest basic pension rates of any modern country, any modern economic country. That's so-called one of the richest. And we have to sometimes say, well, hang on a minute, let's take a stand. And I think today is an opportunity to do that.
We on these benches accept that the earnings growth data have been distorted as a result of the effects of the pandemic directly, and indeed the effects of the furlough scheme and changes in hours. But, my lords, that doesn't mean the government should just ditch its manifesto promises. This, for us, is a matter of principle. It's not just about the questions of the amounts of money. That's why we are choosing to support this amendment, specifically on the earnings link for the state pension. We think that the government should find a way to keep its manifesto promise, to maintain the earnings link, and to do so in an appropriate way. And I do hope the Minister will accept it.
I would remind your Lordships again that the cost of failing to secure royal assent to this bill by mid-November would be in the range of £4 to £5 billion. People over state pension age are entitled to free winter fuel payments worth £2 billion every year, free eye test and NHS prescriptions worth around £900 million every year, and free bus passes worth £1 billion every year.
Well, that's all we have time for. Thank you to you, Susan. But do join me on Monday at 12:15 for Politics Live. Until then, have a very good weekend.